Hi everyone, and welcome to our today's webinar, which is on the US in the West Asia. So my name is Zeinab Ghasemi Tari, and I'm the head of the Institute for North American and European Studies, University of Tehran. A very brief intro to the institute is that it's a research institute affiliated with the University of Tehran and the Faculty of World Studies. And we have postgraduate students and colleagues from different disciplines who are focusing on one specific country from, sort of interdisciplinary approach. So this was a very brief intro to the institute. So I'm going to introduce my panelists, which I'm very much honored to have today. So we start with Alastair Crooke, who is a former senior British diplomat and the founder and director of Conflicts Forum, an organization that advocates for engagement between political Islam and the West. He was formerly advisor on the Middle East issues to Javier Solana at the EU Foreign Policy Chief. He has helped in a number of de-escalations of violence and military withdrawals in Palestine, and he has also a very interesting book, which I strongly suggest my students to read, and that is Resistance, the Essence of Islamic Revolution, in which he provides background on what he calls Islamic revolutions in the Middle East. And he offers a strategic insight into origins and logics of Islamic groups in which have adopted military resistance, military tactic as resistance, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. I'm very happy to introduce Pepe Escobar, who is an independent geopolitical analyst and author, and he's a Brazilian journalist. He writes a column in the Roving Eye for Asia Times Online. And Escobar has focused on Central and West Asia and has covered Iran on a continuous basis since the late 1990s. And since 9/11, he has extensively covered Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia, China, Iran, Iraq, and the wider Middle East. He is also the author of a book, Globalistan, How the Globalized World is Dissolving into Liquid War. So also, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Marandi, who is a professor of English literature and American Studies and the head of the American Studies Department at the University of Tehran. Dr. Marandi has appeared as a political and social commentator on international news networks on Iran, Middle East, and Iran-US relations, and he constantly appears on RT, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and Press TV. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I will also very briefly explain that what we are going to do is each of you have 10 minutes to present your views on the topic. I know the topic is very broad and it's very general. However, we would like to put it within the context that while we are having Trump as a president of the United States, and also putting that in the context of U.S. is facing a sort of serious economic problems due to coronavirus. And also, if we get back to the Middle East, it seems that the level of tensions, conflicts or whatever we may put it, between Iran and the U.S. has increased. It seems it's unprecedented after the hostage crisis, especially with the assassination of Major General Qasem Soleimani. So this is how we're going to have it, 10 minutes. Each of you are going to provide us with your views. And then I've also asked my students to send me their questions. So I have a number of questions that I will ask when we are finished with listening to your views. We'll start with Alastair Crooke and listen to his views on the topic.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. You gave me the lead-in, which I think is an important one, that, everyone is fascinated as the United States is dismembered before our eyes, virtually, in many ways. And of course, that is the determinant of what is going to happen in this next period, and maybe even beyond November. So I will start with the United States, because it's become very complex in the US. And someone summed it up, and I thought it was quite a good line to describe what's happening in the US. And he described it and he said, anarchy below, anarchy above, and the middle is giving way. And I think that's just about right about what we're seeing. Anarchy above, anarchy below, and the middle is in a state of psychic, if you like, distress at the moment. The middle classes, the blue-collar workers, no one knows what's going to happen. And I think that's the other thing I would just like to start off with, because, this is a time when maybe we can say a little bit about where we are now and try and identify where we are. But it's not possible to say what's happening next, even in the next few days. I mean, it's become that difficult. So let us just try and see what we're talking about in terms of the United States. And I think there are a number of these currents that are cutting across the United States. Now, I'm not diving into domestic politics because of the sake of it, for the sake of it, but these currents are relevant to how the United States is looking at the region. All United States policy, foreign policy, is essentially domestic policy, especially in the run-up to an election year. So these things are framing foreign policy. It's no good sort of saying, what is the sort of strategic position towards an Iran or towards Syria or whatever it is? They don't exist. It is what plays well for the election now. It's very important just to say that. Everything in Washington is just calculated. I mean, if a frigate went aground outside China, the first thought they will have is not about our strategic policy towards China. They're going to say, how's this going to play in the election? What's next? What's going to happen? Will the Democrats benefit or the Republicans benefit? So that's why I'm going back to these points. And I think the first thing, and I will probably just start at the bottom and rise up, if you like, but starting at the bottom, what we are seeing and what we are in the middle of is still a new chapter of the American Civil War. The Civil War from 1860, that is still playing out. The blue states versus the red, the Confederate states against, if you like, the urban populations of New York and the big cities with their moralistic view about slavery and about the position of black people in the United States. If it sounds like I'm talking about today, that's no coincidence, because precisely this issue has come back. And we really do have a war going on between red states and blue states, and even within states, there are blue cities against red, if you like, rural areas, and vice versa. So it really is, and it touches on something that is very, very basic to the United States. It's the idea that states have co-sovereignty with the federal government. They are not like in many other places and many other institutions where, if you like, the central government dictates overall the policy. Other states, and this is why there's such a debate about lockdowns and why it's so conflicted and so damaging, is that this idea of co-sovereignty means that many Americans, particularly brought up in the sort of Calvinistic view of individualism and the limits of government policy, that government itself must be very limited and should not interfere in it. And these issues, just to be clear why I'm raising this, even they're in the background, they're not really so much in the background because they're dictating also the question of how to deal with the woke, the BLM issues, but it's also dividing conservative Americans because, and this is something that may tell in the elections, because what you have in the sense is some conservatives who are supporting Trump's use of federal troops who go in with no identities, no markings, not saying who they are, unidentified cars, and arresting people because they're frightened of violence on their streets and are supporting it. And then you have other conservatives, Christian conservatives, who are more libertarian, who view this as the destruction of the whole principles of constitutionality. I suppose if you call them anything, you'd say the constitutionalists against the law and order Christian. This is Trump-based, but it's becoming because of what's been happening with Black Lives Matter, it's becoming a really polarized issue, even within the conservative, let alone between conservatives and democratic elements. So the second thing there, the culture revolution, really is unnerving Americans. Very bad, because people are losing their jobs. They say one thing, and you've seen what happened to people like J.K. Rowling and others, who've have been literally erased from, in terms of literature and their standing and their position because of a phrase which didn't seem to fit with the yoke. And just to give you an important sort of sense of how bitter it is, I mean, the hashtag after her comments, which were not, if you'd said them a year or so ago, no one would have even probably raised an eyebrow. But in the present atmosphere, just to give you a sense of it, the hashtag is burn the witch, burn out. It is really getting almost like, Italy, where I was in the, in the late 1590s, where, if you said the wrong thing about Protestant or Catholic, I mean, you went on the bonfire and were burnt alive. 10,000 Europeans were burnt alive for saying the wrong things at that time. I mean, we're not there yet, of course, and I don't want to exaggerate it, but it is becoming very sort of tense, shall we say. And this is part of another war that is going on in the United States. It's a war between the globalists, because the people funding those who are demonstrating Black Lives Matter are actually the elite themselves, a different part of the elite. It's big philanthropy, it's big business, it is CEOs. This is known colloquially as the Davos elite, the ones that want to move towards global governance, global financial governance, global environmental governance, global health governance in a new form, and to, if you like, remove the sovereignty of peoples and to invest it in a sort of new technocracy who would run the world without politics, as they see it. It would be an apolitical, technocratic government who would control the world by digital means. Basically, just a little bit like you see in China, which is already starting in many places. London is now the third most surveilled and controlled city in the world after two Chinese cities, and well before the rest of the Chinese cities that follow on to it. So it's not just China, it's part of this. And one of the fights that's going on is that Trump understands, and the people around Trump sees this as an effort, if you like, to undermine America as the leader of the world and to move, if you like, the seat of Western power to Europe and give it to Angela Merkel. That's why there's so much hostility towards Angela Merkel and towards Nord Stream and all these issues, because this is an effort. They see this would leave Europe as the new power and America, if you like, as marginalized and without power in this new techno world. The new reality, as Davos, the head of Davos, says. It's on its way, it's coming, it'll be robotization, technocratic, it'll be ghastly. But this is the fight that is going on at the moment. And this is why China comes into it too, very importantly, because I was just looking last night at Steve Bannon, who you all know pretty well, and Steve Bannon was saying, you know what? So we're being told it's too dangerous to go on like this with China, to be, further sanctions. It's too high a risk. He says, this is just coming from the markets. They're all Davos. You know what's about them? They want to do business with China. They've been doing business. Big tech has been doing business. All these companies. Of course they don't want anything. But Trump understands, and he's saying, Trump understands that this is the crucial issue for the future for America. America made a mistake in the past, and if they don't get it right now, America's going anyway. So Davos is playing out even on the China side. It's playing out in terms of these big philanthropy people supporting and funding wokeism, Black Lives Matter. And then there's the last two parts of it, very quickly. Americans really are still in shock from yesterday. It's going to take some time for them to get over it. But the New York Times led with the details that the American GDP dropped by 33% in the last quarter. A third of America's GDP and product went in the second quarter. I mean, that really shocked them because, you know, markets have been full of stories about the V-shaped recovery and have been told, you know, oh, the jobs recovered in the second quarter, the BLS told us. And what has happened? The second leg down has come at a time when the coronavirus is increasing around the world, new records every day in totals, not so much in America now, but American deaths have started to increase again. So this has given a really big shock to people. And it comes at the same time, for the first time, that people are talking very clearly that there could be a collapse of the dollar. I don't want to go into that now, if you want later, but that there might be a loss of confidence in the dollar. And that it's almost inevitable with the amount of money that's being printed and pumped out into the system, that there will be some, if you like, that we're going to see the demise of the dollar in some way. The demise not completely, but the loss of confidence in the dollar. And third thing, and the last thing, of course, we've seen a systemic, carefully orchestrated escalation against China. It wasn't just coincidence, it wasn't bunching. We had every day a statement by different senior officials. And one day it was O'Brien, the security officer. The next day it was Barr, the Attorney General, who said very tough things to American businesses, that if they collaborate with China. And then finally you had Pompeo. And Pompeo said something which is really important to grasp. He turned the conflict with China from a trade war, from an economic war, into an ideological war targeting the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. It's quite different. It puts it into a very different category in terms of security, in terms of military, all sorts. Takes it out of the trade. Now, and that's why I mentioned what Steve Bannon and others had said. They see that a great mistake was made some years ago, and that the only way to correct it is to go full out, and if you like, cut out, disentangle from China. But again, one person put it quite well, and I'll just give it to you as an idea. If there'd been disengagement from China 10 years ago, it would have been like America losing a hand or a couple of hands. If there would have been disengagement from America 10 years ago, it would be like losing two legs. Now, if there's a full disentanglement from China, it would be like taking out a key organ, the lungs or the heart. And that this is what America is going to be facing, and that's what will be. It means we are separating into two quite separate spheres, financial spheres, as well as political spheres. This is the final sort of move towards that. Will the business community persuade Trump not to go ahead with that? I don't think so. I think there is an effort by the Wall Street to say this is too dangerous and everything like that. But I don't think that is going to work, because this is the one thing that a Trump can go on, platform to go on in the election. He can say, they all made mistakes, but I saw, the real danger facing America, and I've done something about it. And I'm going to do something, and we are going to win in this war. Now, it's quite, we may be skeptical, but that's quite a convincing platform. And these things matter because, of course, this China moving to an ideological war is going to bear on Iran. It's going to bear on Iran about its new relationship with China. It's going to bear on the Gulf states because I think we will see that the attempts by China to engage the Gulf states did not work, and that therefore they come to the conclusion that they are still part of the American, if you like, sphere. So we're going to see multiple effects of that. So chaos above. I mean, we have all sorts of chaos. Trump calling for delayed elections, the Epstein evidence being unsealed, which may carry political consequences. Markets in disarray. There's no markets left. And then at the bottom, if you like, anarchy in the streets. I mean, real anarchy in some parts of the street, Portland, Seattle, and places like that, fighting. And if you look at the troops that are dealing with it, I mean, it's like a war. I mean, these people are dressed up like Darth Vader, the American. Unidentified, no markings, helmets, breathing apparatus, firing off pepper sprays and balls at people. Really is quite serious. So I want to stop there. I hope that hasn't taken too long.
Thank you so much. We can go to the Pepe Escobar if you like to.
Can you speak up?
So thank you so much. So now we are going to have Pepe Escobar and listen to his views on the topic.
Thank you very much. For me, it's an enormous pleasure to be here with you. And starting with show business, Alastair is an extremely tough act to follow. So I won't even try to follow him because he gave us the big picture, which is the most important thing as it stands, because this is something that you cannot get from mainstream media, from most discussions on the net, in fact. And it goes all the way from the internal disarray and corrosion of the United States to the larger geopolitical picture where every major player concerned is even more concerned now because of this internal corrosion in the US. When Alastair started, immediately came to mind Yeats, which I think he's very fond of. The center cannot hold, which is something that applies to the US to the letter. Now, it's like we are rereading Yeats' The Second Coming over and over again, applied to the United States. The level of the internal civil war and cultural war, even for us, of course, we follow American politics practically on a daily basis, is mind-boggling because now, if we want to go back to what Baudrillard used to say in the 80s about everything is a simulacra, in fact, now we are in a sort of room full of mirrors with simulacra reflecting other simulacra, because people, they lost the cultural, intellectual parameters to analyze what's going on in front of them. Alastair explained to us in detail these different factions pitted against each other, how everything that's going on is being politicized endlessly by the Republicans and by the Democrats. What's going on with the Trump administration, I see it's something extremely interesting because I think they're trying to find the nerve that is going to touch the so-called silent majority. And they're probably getting there with the failed experience of the Seattle Commune and what's been going on in Portland for practically 2 months now, including those Trump green men in their mercenary outfits, exactly, in the streets of the United States, which is something that we were used to see in Afghanistan, in Iraq, but not inside the United States, right? With their patches with numbers, which identify them. They cannot be identified with their names, badges, but they have numbers here. So this means there is a database of these forces, which, by the way, are privatized. These are federal forces, but essentially privatized. So we can talk about mercenaries in the streets of the U.S., ultimately. And when you compare this, okay, let's try to impose some sort of federal order in the middle of anarchy. When we compare to what's going on with what Republican pollsters are saying, but among themselves, I had access to some of these discussions. Some people linked to the Republicans, businessmen essentially. They sent me some conclusions by these Republican pollsters in swing states, suburbs, and tracking the female vote, essentially. And they're saying, look, it's going to be a landslide. Pro-Trump, which is something, when you compare to the way the New York Times and the Washington Post are covering, or CNN for that matter, it's a completely different scenario, right? And then, something very interesting that happened last week, if I'm not mistaken. The latest Rasmussen poll. Rasmussen, they are very serious polling outfit, right? And in their latest poll, Trump and Biden are running neck to neck, which once again has nothing to do with this 10-point, 14-point gap that we read endlessly on American mainstream media and CNN and company, right? So the dystopian level applies also to the perception level by the Democratic machine, and what the Republicans are probably working silently, just like they did in 2016 with Cambridge Analytica. Nobody was talking about, okay, very few people were talking about Cambridge Analytica throughout 2016. And we were always getting the same scenario. Oh, Hillary's 10 points ahead. And look what happened at the end. So if we compare the situation, midsummer, let's say, 2016, 2020, it's not much different. In terms of the cultural war, which Alastair has been tracking the cultural war in the US in a series of outstanding pieces, in fact, opposing exactly the constitutionalists and the woke generation, essentially, right? The woke generation, they are totally infiltrated, even if they don't know it. Black Lives Matter and Antifa are completely infiltrated by the deep state. In fact, they're being run by the deep state, which is something that if you say that in the US, they immediately you're a neo-fascist or a fascist straight away, right? There's an enormous difference between well-intentioned groups of students in the US protesting police violence. Okay, that's quite legitimate. And Black Lives Matter, the organization, and the subgroups around and across Black Lives Matter, lavishly funded, like Alastair said, with full support from corporate America, with Jamie Dimon kneeling in front of his safe, which is an absolutely outstanding image, right? So, and exactly, this is very useful for the deep state, especially to provoke a level of confusion that in the end will lead to having a deep state candidate winning the election in November. Particularly, I don't consider Joe Biden even a candidate. I consider him really a cadaver. He's a cadaver in the basement. The real president of the United States is going to be the next vice president, is probably going to be chosen this month in August. with a few usual suspects as candidates. Kamala Harris, the return of Hillary Clinton, of course, and Susan Rice, which, according to many of my conversations, she is the deep state candidate. I don't know if Alastair and you, Mohammad, you agree with me, but I'm getting this feedback increasingly that they want Susan Rice. But it's very hard to sell Susan Rice to the American public because she doesn't have political exposure. She doesn't have a recognized face or past because she was involved in national security matters during the Obama administration. And she's not as photogenic as Kamala Harris, which is an American personality. And obviously, she doesn't have if push comes to shove, the pop star Beyoncé quality of Michelle Obama, which can be another candidate of the last minute for the Democrats. The real next president, let's put it this way. So everyone is absolutely lost into this wilderness. Nobody talks about the Joe Biden campaign actually proposes. They don't seem to have a national or international program. In fact, their international foreign policy is very well organized, like in the Obama years. The guy who's running the people around Biden for foreign policy is Tony Blinken. Tony Blinken is an extremely dangerous character. He was the guy behind Obama's silent wars, including those famous meetings every week to decide, okay, who's going to be chosen this week in the kill list. So he's going to have a Hellfire missile on his back, you know. So just to give all of you watching us how dangerous this is in terms of if we have a Dem as president, we're going to have a hot war in 2021. This is practically certain. We don't know against who. So when you expand all this internal disarray and these machinations to the international arena, especially including China, then the echoes that I'm getting from China, and Mohammad, you can also correct me or not on that, is that the leadership now is absolutely, in fact, for the past, let's say, 8 to 10 months or even a year, that the full spectrum dominance war by the Trump administration against them is here, and that's it. And there's no plan B. There's nothing else, in fact. So how they are going to react and how they're going to, in fact, talking about the decoupling, the possible decoupling, in fact, the slowly in progress decoupling of both economies, in fact, two spheres, a westernized American-dominated sphere, including Europe, mostly, maybe not much of Eastern Europe, and the Asian-Eurasian sphere, where we're going to have predominance of China, but partnerships of China with Russia, Iran, Pakistan, etc. It seems that the Chinese, even in the soft power sphere, now they are upping their game. They are responding to all these provocations by the Americans in real time, by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or by editorials in the Global Times, who are becoming immensely popular all over the world. They are, for instance, now that's resurfaced, that they are fine, and Mohammad can give us details about that. That famous $400 billion 25-year Iran-China strategic partnership, which is huge in terms of Eurasia integration. The fact that India, once again, they shot themselves in their feet because basically they are abdicating of their strategic relationship with Iran, including the Chabahar port, right? So China, soon we're going to have China controlling Gwadar port in Pakistan, and then you go 80 kilometers to the west, Chabahar port in Iran as well. So, you know, key parts of the Indian Ocean, the CPEC, this China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, but also what was until yesterday the Indian-Afghan Silk Road. So, and this is going at breakneck speed and all that. The Russia-China strategic partnership closer and closer, even with all the problems. And this is something that Alastair is very much aware. Discussions in the Valdai Club, that kind of thing. Even with a lot of resistance, but they're getting closer and closer all the time. And of course, what's going to happen with the key relationship, this part of the world, Eurasia, Germany, Russia, with Merkel 6 months at the head of the European Union, the rotating presidency, German industrialists saying now openly, we want to do business with Russia and China. This is what interests us, and we know that we are being stabbed in the back by the Americans all the time. So even the Atlanticists inside Germany, they are very uncomfortable with what is very important part of the Trump administration strategy. This is something that Trump was saying even during his campaign in 2016. Germany is practicing dumping with the euro, and they are, getting destroying American jobs. Same thing with Japan and the yen. So the Trump offensive is against the euro, against the yen as well. Not only against China and the yuan. So, and this is going at, once again, breakneck speed, but to a point where we cannot predict the speed of the decoupling. Just like Alastair said, we cannot even predict what's going to happen after November, geopolitically. The fact that, once again, now that it's advertised to the whole global south that Russia and China are trying to get to having all their business, bilateral business, in their own currencies. This is a very, very strong message to everybody, all over the global south. So the decoupling from the dollar as much as possible is in effect. And the level of desperation of the Trump administration reaches a point where we have, for instance, the American ambassador in Brazil openly says that Brazil is going to have serious problems if they adopt 5G by Huawei. Huawei is very, very strong in Brazil, just like in many other global south nations, apart from the fact that China is Brazil's #1 trade partner. And the way it is seen in Washington, and this is bipartisan, in fact, South America, Latin America is our backyard. It's still the Monroe Doctrine. And they are terrified that even with a pro-American government with Bolsonaro, Chinese business continues to make inroads. So all of this is interconnected in a sense, once again, of the Trump administration seem to have a strategy which is China, 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 which is the strategy that Steve Bannon sold to President Trump. They don't know how to apply China, 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 but if you listen to what Mike Pompeo says in a press conference launching an ideological Cold War 2.0, most serious politicians and diplomats around the world, they laughed about it. It was a joke. But if this is the best they can do, coupled, of course, with the absolute disasters of COVID-19, which we're not even beginning to see what's going to happen when we're going to have people who cannot pay their mortgages anymore and are on the level of practically starvation hit American streets all over the place. So this is where we are. It's extremely worrying. It's a nihilistic scenario. It's something that in the past I used to say the Mad Max scenario, but I think the Mad Max scenario now is starting to apply to America. And Americans, as we all know, most of them, they understand the world in the language of movies. So, welcome to the Mad Max world.
That was great, Pepe. Very good. Yeah.
So thank you so much. We can get to Dr. Marandi and listen to his views and then to the questions.
Well, thank you very much. I've actually been having these conversations with Alastair and Pepe for many years now. And a lot of what we're talking about today is what my two dear friends have been saying for a very long time. And the expectation that the world will move in this general direction is something that we've been discussing in our conversations. The only thing that's changed is that the sudden rise of the virus, the COVID virus, has pushed things into, towards fast forward. Now things are moving much more swiftly. The economic situation in the United States after the crisis in 2008, I recall on many occasions, in conversations with Pepe and Alastair, where the belief has always been that this is just going to get worse, the bubbles are going to increase in size, and ultimately a crisis much worse than what we saw in 2008 will reappear. And while I've rarely heard others say this sort of thing in other conversations, but this has always been a regular theme among the three of us. Many in Iran, for example, always speak about the decline of the United States, but I think for many it's sort of like ideological or wishful thinking. But none of what we're seeing, in my opinion, is unexpected. If we were to take an objective view at the situation, both in our region but also globally, I think this is what we shouldn't have expected anything other than this. What we're seeing now in the United States, in my opinion, although it goes back to the Civil War in the United States, this is the deepest divide that the United States has seen since the Civil War. But I think a lot of it has to do with the economic crisis that the United States is facing, and which has resulted from decades of policies in the United States that has led the country to this. So we've seen African Americans and blacks in the United States treated horrifically in the past, or murdered or beaten in horrific ways in the past on camera, leading to riots and unrest and protests. But I think what's different now is that the United States, economically speaking, has lost its middle class, and many people across the country are facing financial desperation. That this American exceptionalism, the American dream, all of these are dead for many Americans. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, there were huge protests, both on behalf of those who supported the rights of African Americans, but also those who were opposing the Vietnam War. But when the war came to an end and the laws changed in the United States, they mostly disappeared. Why? Because, in my opinion, the United States had a strong middle class. People went back to living their ordinary lives, and life went on as normal again. But now things are very different. The new normal now is one of desperation for many Americans. The collapse of the economy, the 33% decline that was announced a couple of days ago, and of course what Pepe and Alastair were sort of alluding to, the future of mortgages and the rents that people have to pay and the unemployment benefits that people are receiving. All of these are ultimately going to have to end. And Alastair, I think, later was planning to speak about the imminent problems that the U.S. dollar is going to face. So, in my opinion, what we're seeing now in the United States is a crisis, but it is going to get worse. And so, unlike the 1960s, where the U.S. left Vietnam and then a few laws were changed to the benefit of African Americans, we do not see any sort of prospects for an improved situation in the United States in the imminent future. And while this is happening, a number of things I think have helped to push this forward. One is the coronavirus, which has intensified this crisis. Another is the internal divisions in the United States, and I'm talking about the political establishment. The people, the population, I think it's even more complicated. But when Trump came to power, the Democratic Party, instead of facing up to reality about their own corruption and the corrupt nature of their candidate, they tried to pin the blame on Russia, and we had Russiagate. So what the Americans did, or the Democrats, is that they destroyed the U.S.-Russian relationship and in order to damage Trump, which was useless, but what it did was that it distanced Russia from the United States. And one of the things about the United States is that when laws are passed, reversing them are almost impossible. When Nelson Mandela and the ANC were terrorists, according to American law, that law remained in the books until 2008. In other words, Nelson Mandela was freed from prison. The ANC came to power. He became president. He was still a terrorist, according to U.S. law. He retired from politics. Years later, in 2008, he was removed, and the ANC was removed from the books in the United States. So every time he had to go to the United States, for example, for the UN General Assembly, he had to get special permission to enter the country because he was a declared terrorist, according to U.S. law. So now that the laws and the sanctions have been put in place against Russia, it's almost impossible to reverse them. On the other hand, and again, this was already discussed and well explained, the United States, and Trump in particular, is scapegoating China. True, China is a rising rival of the United States, but the pace in which the U.S. is moving towards a new Cold War is not based upon some calculation in order to preserve U.S. dominance and hegemony. This has more to do with the election. And therefore, Trump is rapidly destroying the relationship with China, not based upon the interests of the United States, but based upon self-preservation, because for him the objective is getting reelected. So the Democrats destroyed the Russian relationship, and the Russians and the Republicans were too scared to do anything about it. They didn't want to be seen as Russian agents. And now the Democrats will not stand in the way of Trump destroying the relationship with China for the same reason. And this creates a new situation for Iran, because in the past, Iran was largely isolated by the United States. And of course, antagonized, and sanctions were imposed, brutal sanctions and crippling sanctions. Under Obama, they were called crippling sanctions, and under Trump, they're called brutal sanctions by the two presidents. And Iran had a very tough time, although to its immense credit, the Iranians continued to move forward. Iran continued to weaken the U.S. position across the region. And the United States, its problems with Iran gradually increased despite all these sanctions. However, with the deteriorating relationship with China and Russia, this provides new openings for Iran. As things stand, the United States is attempting to push China after, out of one country after another, from Britain, from Brazil, as Pepe just mentioned, but also there's talk that the United States is going to attempt to force the countries in the Persian Gulf to move away from 5G with China and to expel China. And this, I must point out, that benefits Iran tremendously, because China and Russia both see Iran as a country that is independent of the United States, whereas these other countries, if they abide by U.S. demands, will be revealing themselves as unreliable partners. And the same, of course, is true with the Israeli regime. The Chinese have also often looked at Israel, in my opinion, mistakenly, as a key partner for a couple of reasons. One, because the Israelis are linked to Washington, and both the Chinese and the Russians always hoped that maybe through Israel they could gain greater influence in the United States. That is changing because the Israelis are being forced to push these countries out of key projects, in particular the Chinese, the desalination plant project. They've been expelled, 5G expelled. So that is going to hurt the relationship between especially China and the Israeli regime. And in addition to that, they always considered the Israelis to be experts in counterterrorism. And again, I think it's obviously based upon a myth. The Israelis create terrorism through apartheid, through ethnic cleansing, and through the systematic oppression of the Palestinian people. But we have to keep in mind that the Chinese do not know this region very well. And the American narrative, the Israeli narrative, and the Saudi narrative has always been very powerful in China. But as this relationship becomes increasingly problematic, I think that there's going to be a powerful or an important rethink in Beijing. And I think the same is true in Moscow. So the United States, through its policies, is creating a convergence among these different countries, especially Iran, China, and Russia, but I believe other countries can be added to this list of nations. So on the one hand, with regards to U.S. foreign policy, it's creating a grouplet or a group of countries that are going to resist the United States for reasons of self-preservation. This is not an alliance, but this is these are countries that have common interests in resisting U.S. policy. And the United States is also, as alluded to earlier, is doing the same thing to its European allies by antagonizing Germany, by trying to prevent energy trade or the expansion of energy trade between Europe and Russia. The Americans are hurting the relationship in a way in which I think cannot be repaired, or at least cannot easily be repaired. But in my opinion, this is just one part of the problem that the United States faces. Another is the United States has succeeded in destroying its soft power. This is largely to do with Trump himself, but also the catastrophic economic situation and the rapid spread of the coronavirus in the United States, I think has shown the rest of the world that the United States is much more vulnerable and much weaker than they ever expected. And seeing these troops on the streets kidnapping people and taking them away, these are scenes that we're seeing across the world. So, as Pepe said, we're used to seeing Americans kidnapping people in Afghanistan and in occupied countries like Iraq, or doing what they want in Syria, but not in the United States. And at the third level, I think, so one is American soft power, American influence abroad, but I think also the divisions in the United States are just beginning to be more broadly recognized. Black Lives Matter is, I think, a very misleading term because, as Alastair and Pepe have pointed out, the organization or the money behind it is very mainstream. And it is the Democratic Party, it is much of the deep state, it is much of the wealthy elite, the globalists, the wealthy elite in the United States that are behind it. So there's the Democratic Party that is trying to hijack the broader movement. But the broader movement without the official name is our ordinary people who are on the streets. And there is the Democratic Party is trying to take control of this uprising among a certain segment of American society. They're African Americans, they're blacks, they're minorities, but also there are many white Americans who are protesting against the system, both its racism, but also the issue of social justice, which is destroying much of the United States. So I think right now the United States is divided into three categories. One is the pro-Trump group, which includes it's mostly white, many impoverished Americans who've suffered the consequences of liberalism and capitalism. Then there is the opposition, but that opposition is, I think, divided into two broad groups. One is the official Black Lives Matter faction, the newly kneeling American political establishment. But a third faction is also the real Black Lives Matter, let's say, those who are on the streets and who are outraged because they can no longer tolerate things as they stand. So the opposition to Trump is not a monolithic entity. It is very broad, fragmented, and I don't think that if this economic situation in the United States continues to deteriorate, which I think it will, I don't think that this is going to be controllable.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to get to the students' questions, and the questions are more concerned with what is the implication of the United States' internal or domestic issues on U.S. policy in the region. It's mostly concerned with that part, probably because we are living in this side of the world and students are more concerned with those questions. So the first question is, do you think Iran's pivot to Asia, and they mean that actually this pivot to China, will change the dynamics of Iran-US relations? Can this change US policy in the region?
Yeah, start off with Pepe, I think, because, on China, he is the master. So,
no way.
And can we ask him, this is a personal addition, how much is China worried about entering into a relationship with Iran? How much is China frightened that this may bring, an even more adverse reaction from Washington, a more serious sort of punchback, if you like? There are articles out now saying, this is strategic disaster for the US if this happens. What do the Chinese fear about it too, if that would be all right, to add to your question?
Well, and this is something that I would ask Mohammad as well. What I read from the Iranian press, at least in English, was very sketchy about the long-term strategic partnership. There are no details. Of course, some people have drafts. We don't have the final terms yet. But I'm very, very interested in what would be Ayatollah Khamenei's personal reading of this strategic partnership. Not only the Rouhani administration, but how the leadership sees it strategically long-term, because this is an immense strategic move with so many repercussions, right? In China, it's interesting because the coverage in Chinese media was also relatively sketchy, with not so many details. They are not. I haven't read any in-depth analysis yet by, for instance, a top Chinese think tank about it. Maybe you have it, Mohammad. So I think it's too early to tell, because we have to and everybody who's analyzing it, we have to put into perspective, in terms of Eurasia integration as a whole, what it means, in terms of closer Russia-China-Iran partnership, in terms of the interaction between the China-Pakistan economic corridor and what actual investments by the Chinese are going to be related to the new Silk Roads in Iran, and if this is all going to converge, in fact. So this would, implicitly, this would mean that Iran and Pakistan and China would form a triumvirate of interests that will change the equation completely. And they would aggregate more and more Afghanistan towards this orbit. And how they're going to relate with Russia, if Russia would have other strategic interests in dealing with Iran. I think we still don't know about that. It's too early to tell. So, Mohammad, I would like to hear you from on the point of view of how the Iranian leadership is looking at this partnership. Of course, it's not ready yet. It's not signed yet.
Well, I think that it's not so much a pivot to China rather than a pivot away from Europe and the United States. And the Iranians, what they're trying to do now is that they're really trying to do what they should have been doing 4 decades ago, and that is to look more globally, to have a more global view of their relationships. And despite the fact that the revolution in Iran itself was about independence and sovereignty and dignity and freedom from hegemony, but I think that in many ways we have been unable to match those ideals with policies on the ground. So the current administration in Iran under President Rouhani and under previous administrations, Ahmadinejad and Khatami and the late Mr. Rafsanjani, I think that they failed to move in this direction, even though Ayatollah Khamenei, I think about 25 years ago, first spoke about looking to the east. So what we're now seeing is this shift in Iran, where the United States has revealed itself to be completely unreliable and dishonest, and both under Obama and Trump, by the way. Obama never fulfilled his obligations within the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. And Trump, of course, is Trump. And Europe, on the other hand, they've shown themselves to be useless, because despite all the good words and the nice words, the Europeans have abided by the demands of Trump completely. And they are in total violation of the JCPOA. And the only countries that are resisting the United States are non-Western countries. And of course, the most important of them is China and Russia, but there are others as well. So Dr. Larijani, the former Speaker of Parliament, he began an initiative and traveled to China, met the president, and this led to this document which is a sort of roadmap where the two sides are basically, there are no numbers in it or anything like that. There are no clear-cut, projects that are defined in it, but it's a roadmap where the two countries are basically making a political statement once it is signed that our relationship is going to be a long-term relationship. And it does not interfere with Iran's relationship or China's relationship, going back to what Alastair was saying, with other countries. So the Chinese and the Iranians are very careful and keen on developing a relationship, but they don't want to give any excuse for any third party to antagonize it. China is cautious, obviously, because they are concerned about the reaction of the United States. But what we are seeing in the United States is an increased antagonism towards China, and the United States is attacking China left, right, and center. Initially, when this whole process began with the trade war, many in China thought that they could somehow contain this and that they could come to some sort of agreement. But it's turned out that this is largely bipartisan in the United States, and that the United States is not going to ease up this move towards political war against China, and not just China, but as you both mentioned, it's now the Communist Party of China that the Americans talk about rather than China. So I think that China is going to have to make some decisions in the future. They cannot continue to take hits from the United States and not respond in kind, because ultimately that is going to lead them towards a very dangerous situation. And I think that is something that the Iranians have a lot of experience with. Every time that the Iranians gave concessions to the United States, ultimately the United States used those concessions to its advantage. They saw it as a sign of weakness. Every time the Iranians tried to resolve their problems with the United States, it was during the Rafsanjani presidency with Conoco giving them an oil field in the Persian Gulf. The Americans hammered Iran as a result. Then when the Iranians cooperated over Afghanistan, they became the axis of evil, and the list goes on. And of course, the JCPOA itself, the Americans never intended. And I think this is something, again, the three of us have discussed before. The Americans never intended to abide by their side of the bargain. Of course, I've never been an opponent of the nuclear deal, and I've never been a fan of the nuclear deal. But I think it was clear. I mean, I think that the most positive thing about the nuclear deal for ordinary Iranians is that it showed ordinary people in Iran and many people outside of Iran that the problem does not lie with Iran. It's not Iran that is trying to, use the United States as an ideological tool for self-preservation. Rather, it's the United States that has been doing this, and the Iranians have tried to solve their problems. But in any case, the Chinese are, I think, going to have and I think they're already beginning to move in that direction. I think the Chinese are recognizing that even if Trump leaves office, which is not, by the way, for certain, again, the polls, in 2016, as was explained, very correctly, they showed Clinton would win, and she didn't. And we still have 3 months till Election Day. And I do recall, before the 2016 election, I was speaking with Alastair, and Alastair was saying that there's a rebellion going on in the FBI. And lo and behold, a couple of days later, they announced an investigation on the Clinton emails, and that dented emails' chances for winning the election, and ultimately, of course, it helped her lose, although I don't believe that's the reason. She was corrupt, and she was an extension of corrupt political and economic practices, but that's another story. I mean, to lose to someone like Trump, who was broadly seen as a buffoon, says a lot about Clinton and the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And so now, as I think it was Alastair who said, for example, the what should we call it? Epstein suicide, or Epstein being suicided, and who knows what could happen in the next 3 months? What could be revealed? So now we have Clinton's name coming out in the open. Who knows what sort of tools Trump has at his disposal to change the fate of the election in the next 3 months? So while it is completely unclear who is going to win the election, I think the Chinese do recognize that things are not going to go back to normal, and that and I think over the next 3 months, again, as was said earlier, there's a lot more that can and probably will be done to destroy the U.S.-Chinese relationship. TikTok is just one small example. So I think that this convergence of interest between Iran and China and Iran and Russia will continue, but I don't think it's going to be an alliance of any sort. I don't think Iran is interested in that. I don't think China is interested in that, and I don't think Russia is interested in that. But I do think that these countries are being, thanks to the United States, moving closer to each other because of these mutual interests. And I think that the fact that the Americans are pushing the Saudis and they're pushing the Brazilians and they're pushing the Europeans, that only intensifies this convergence. And I think the Chinese may actually see, if the Americans push too hard, that in the Persian Gulf region, they really need Iran much more than they thought before. I don't know if Alastair, if you have any thoughts on this, because Pepe and I don't know if I've answered the question adequately.
You've both argued it, answered it very completely. I think that I agree entirely. We're going to see this relationship with Americas, with China, and that pulling apart into two different spheres. And I don't think there'll be that much room for people who want to sit on the fence as time goes on. They may think they can sit on the fence for a while. And that includes Europeans, by the way. Europeans are trying to sit on the fence as much as they can. Germany perhaps is the most sort of coming off the fence towards China, and Britain the least, or not at all. But I don't think Europe, it's going to divide Europe deeply, may even paralyze it and break it up. This China issue coupled with the issue that we all know, the crisis in Europe over the coronavirus and the financial system of Europe. So yeah, that's really all.
So I'm going to ask another question from Alastair. So this is one of the questions the student sent. It says, how do you see the prospect of having Biden in the White House? And do you think he will change his policy toward Iran?
I think that it is quite an important question, although one has to, first of all, make the caveat, which I think Pepe has already hinted at. But effectively, it's quite likely that even if Biden is elected, which is possible, quite possible, he won't be in office for very long. We all know his condition is deteriorating quite sharply. And under Article 25, he may be, of the Constitution, US Constitution, he may have to stand down in favor of a vice president. So, I mean, you know, it's difficult to say. Let us then just say a little bit of what it's looking like. I mean, subject to whoever is coming in, because that may change it. If it's someone like Susan Rice or something, it'll be probably a bit different. But let's say the first things. I mean, first of all, Biden is a long-standing Zionist, a long-standing friend of Israel. That's not going to change. He's very much in that view. Now, I do think there is something that is going to change policy, but it's difficult to quantify exactly, because what it is essentially the woke revolution has an external element to it. The complaint about racism and also, if you like, oppression in the United States is not only applied to that, but their spokesmen apply it to the world. And of course, it's very obvious about the Palestinian issue that we've nearly moved to a sort of one-state solution where the Palestinians would be nothing but second-class citizens in that. It is going to influence, I believe, whoever is, if it's a democratic administration. You can't be bending the knee and kneeling down and saying you absolutely reject racism and, if you like, oppression of a people on one hand, and then sort of go out and embrace Israel in the same way that they have been doing for the last decades. So I think it will have an effect, and we saw in one respect to it, as I say, Biden, who's a strong Zionist, actually turned against annexation, did not support annexation. And also within the Democratic Party, there are two other influences that are important about it. One is that there is a division in American Jewry between the reformists and the orthodox. And even some of the reformists have been talking about saying, okay, yes, but isn't it time to go to a one-state solution that is not Zionist, which is secular? And this set off a firestorm around, the heartland of reform Jewry in America. So I think this is also the split in the money, the conservative money. Jewry is still, of course, with the Republicans and with Trump, but it's still going to have a factor on it. The other thing is that quite clearly, as part of the deal, it seems, Sanders is having an influence on the Democratic platform. Even though he's regarded as an outlier by the establishment, Sanders is being brought in to try and make Biden appear centrist. And Sanders, who is Jewish, came out very firmly with the most Palestinian program that we've seen from any political leader when he was in New York. So that's another thing. What does it mean for Iran? I think it means this, that the people surrounding Biden, he's bringing back all the old stalwarts who negotiated the JCPOA. And what they are saying, these people, is, yes, we need to try and resurrect the JCPOA, fine, but we need to take account of the errors that were made in the first place. What were those errors, as they see it? Their view of those errors was we didn't include Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel, and we didn't keep them in the picture, although Israel was kept in the picture, of course. But that's their view of that. And we didn't deal with Iran's malign activities in the region, as they term it. We're talking about Hezbollah and Hamas and all of these bogies that they go about, and the missiles have to be on the table. And on that, there's sort of European support too, incidentally. I don't think this has a hope. I don't think Iran for a second will accept to talk on those, or even want to enter negotiations when a democratic team thinks it's going to reintroduce it with all these add-ons. And then there'll be everything else. I mean, gender equality and, prisoner rights. And, it will become a sort of huge package. And I don't think Iran would have any interest. They've already begun the shift to the east. They will continue the shift to the east. I don't think, this is water under the bridge now. I don't think Iran is going to want to go back to that old history. Inspections of nuclear sites and the IEA and controls on centrifuges and all of that. I just think it's gone. It's over. And I think that the way the Democrats are likely to handle it if they come into office will mean that there'll be no interest in this in Iran, unless, of course, as the Iranian position is, of course, if America should completely undertake to go back into the JCPOA as it was, then Iran would listen to them. But I don't think that's going to be the case.
So thank you so much. So the other question is on. The question is, do you think this indirect confrontations between Iran and the US in the region will enable the United States to limit Iran's maneuvering power in the region? So I think what they mean is that, this will lead to something in the region that would create a sort of consensus among other countries that Iran should be isolated and, in a sense, Iran's power should be limited.
What sort of thing do you mean that would, what you're saying is that if something happened, it would unify the globe against Iran and completely isolate it? Is that it? And can we think of what sort of circumstances where Iran might find itself completely isolated? Or have I got that wrong?
So they're saying this, that these sort of indirect confrontations that we see in the region, like what is happening in Iraq or sometimes in the Persian Gulf. So if in a sort of military attack by Iranians against the U.S. interest in the region will take place, and this would limit Iran's maneuvering power, so that the whole region would, get united against Iran. I think this is the question: is that we know that the whole region is, in a sense, the Persian Gulf at least is against Iran. But the question is, if this will, in a sense, lead to isolation of the Iranians.
Well, I'm not quite sure I got to grasp the question completely, but we are in a very tense period, and the American policy is to escalate the pressures on Iran, very obviously, and on Iraq, and in Syria. I mean, where Jeffries, the envoy on behalf of President Trump, says, my task is to turn Syria into a quagmire for Mr. Putin. And in Lebanon, where the Lebanese are under, existential pressure. And these pressures are all growing. I think the risk is not so much that Iran is going to have no maneuverability or be completely isolated, but this can end up in a much bigger war than maybe the United States wants or expects. I don't think Trump wants war with Iran. I just want to be very clear about that. I don't think so, because really the Middle East, no one is even thinking about it in the US at the moment. They're only thinking about what's happening in Seattle, what's happening with lockdown, what's happening to the economy. The only thing they think about is China, but not Iran, not anything else. That does not mean the provocations will stop, because I think they're largely being driven by CENTCOM, which is on a very loose leash from the Pentagon and has its own policies, which they pursue for political ambitions. So I think that this, this will increase these pressures. And of course, they're coming from Israel. These pressures, because Israel is explicitly saying that they've increased the pressures on Iran during this period, because they know Iran is circumscribed in the degree in which it can push back in the period up to an election, because Iran does not want to create the circumstances in which Trump has no alternative but to do some reaction. So I think we can say that, but I don't see that this is going to leave Iran isolated in some ways. I do think that because the circumstances of this action by the United States, the language, the rhetoric, the bombast from Mr. Pompeo particularly, is affecting the globe, and people are not likely to turn on Iran and say this is Iran's fault. Iran has played this very, very well and carefully by, if you like, responding in a carefully calibrated way to this attempt to starve Iran, to put it under a siege. Very carefully calibrated and in a deniable way. Even today, no one knows what happened at Al-Qaeda, at the attack on the Aramco. Who knows who was responsible? The intelligence services of the West have no idea still, even after this period. I don't know who is responsible, but I'm saying that the whole of this has been carefully calibrated not to end up in a face-to-face confrontation between Iran and the United States. And I think Iran will continue that calibration, calibrated carefully down. But it's quite possible, that something will go wrong. Like, we saw a near miss with the Oman airliner the other day, which could easily be things, any of those could have tipped us into something much more serious. That's a real possibility. Is it going to polarize the world? Well, everything depends on the circumstances. And the greatest danger we have today, in my view, is of a false flag operation, an event which makes it look that Iran or the Hashad al-Shaabi in Iraq or Hezbollah have done something outrageous, but it's a false flag exercise, and that then we see some sort of retaliation. Just as we had those false flag stories that came out of the White Helmets about chemical weapons being used on the Syrian population, which now the OPC have shown are completely untrue. They were not there, and it would never happen, and the narrative was falsified. But that sort of thing, I think, is a real danger, like we saw with all those allegations of chemical weapons and pictures of people supposedly dying of poison gas, when it was all stage managed by an organizations which were funded by mostly European intelligence services.
Well, briefly, just I think Alastair hit the nail on the head in terms of the false flag. And we should be worried about this window of the next 3 months. They only have a window of less than 3 months to pull off a major false flag to implicate Iran. For the moment, the provocations have been very crude, like those two fighter jets basically terrorizing a passenger Mahan Air flight. This was extremely crude, and it backfired because, especially all over the global south, and even in parts of Europe, this was interpreted as an act of terrorism, in fact, that could have victimized a passenger plane, just like the Iranian pilot said. He was extremely worried that he would be shot by Syrian artillery because he would be mistaken as a foreign intruder. So this is very, very, very dangerous. And, you know, when you have almost 3 months of similar operations ahead, so this could be something related to the Hashd al-Shaabi in Iraq. This could be a false flag like we had a few days ago. This could be something, in terms of what happened, in fact, not between Hezbollah and Israelis, because what actually happened at the border was the Israelis freaking out, in fact, that Hezbollah was on a shadow incursion, when in fact there was no Hezbollah at all in the picture. Fascinating. And when you look at the way the Israeli media cover it, they were changing the narrative like every half an hour or 1 hour. It was a joy to watch, in fact. So clumsy. Right? But, as Alastair said, Netanyahu has announced, trumpeted all over the world, that they are after something big against Iran, preferably. CENTCOM, exactly, it's not the Trump administration. CENTCOM rules what happens. Mohammad, you know better than all of us. And they could maybe come up with I would say, an unusually clever false flag within the next 3 months. I don't think it's going to happen. The problem is that in terms of, apart from the usual suspects, which means Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Emirates, you know, and obviously the European Union, because they don't have free will in terms of foreign policy, the rest of the planet, the whole global south, sees this harassment campaign against Iran for what it is now. This is seen in Pakistan, even in India, with all the Indian shortcomings, in Latin America, in Africa, so in Central Asia. So you cannot say that Iran is isolated. I would never venture to say that. In terms of, it's not that Iran has learned how to sell themselves in terms of soft power, but because the ritual aggressions by the usual suspects against Iran have been so blatant that now it's very easy to interpret them for what they are, in fact. So I think this has changed, especially the past year or so. Mohammad, I think you have to wrap this all up in terms of, do you see any realistic possibility of an effective false flag could be in Iraq in terms of, let's say, Hashd al-Shabi is killing American soldiers in Iraq. That would be the scenario, right? Or something involving Hezbollah, or even inside Syria, where the Americans are illegally occupying parts of the northeast because of the oil. Do you see any realistic possibility within this window of the next 3 months of CENTCOM and the Israelis together pulling off a game changer in terms of pointing the finger at Iran to say they are the culprit?
I think there are a couple of things that we have to think of first, or always keep in mind when we discuss a false flag operation. And they are basically linked to what's going on in the region. I think that because of the global economic crisis that we discussed earlier, the crisis in this region is particularly dangerous. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, all of them are literally completely dependent on energy exports. And the price of oil and gas and energy in general has collapsed. It's declined dramatically. I think right now it's roughly $40 a barrel oil as we speak, more or less. Alastair would know much better. But the earnings of these countries have declined. Their exports under U.S. demand and orders from Washington have declined, but their expenditures are very high. The Saudis are fighting a war in Yemen, which they've lost, but it's costing huge amounts of money. The siege on Qatar is expensive. And the new war, I mean, one of the extraordinary things is that the Turkish president and the Saudis were allies. And the Qataris and the Emiratis, they were all allies in destroying Syria and in supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Jaish al-Islam and all the other extremist groups under the patronage of the United States, of course, and that, especially Obama. They were all supportive of the invasion of Yemen and the destruction of the country. They were all together in it at the beginning of the devastation of Yemen by Saudi Arabia. But now they're completely divided. They're into two camps, the Turks and the Qataris on the one hand, the Saudis and the Emiratis on the other. And now we see that the two sides are on close to war in Libya over the spoils of the country. Libya destroyed by NATO, turned into a place where you can buy and sell slaves on the streets. And now these allies from the past are at each other's throats. But they're at each other's throats at a time of great economic crisis, as I said, in the Persian Gulf region, but also in Turkey. Tourism is dead. The Turkish economy badly devastated. But Iran, on the other hand, is probably the country that's been deeply affected by the virus, but less affected economically than other countries. Iran has been hurt, but not nearly as badly as these countries because of the sanctions. Because of the sanctions, the Iranians have not been exporting much oil, so they've become used to living without oil. The Iranians, because of the sanctions, don't have a large tourism industry or an airlines industry or a hotel. The hotels in Turkey, in Istanbul alone, all of them being shut down is huge, or in the Emirates. But in Iran, you don't have a very large tourism industry, so Iran's hurt is limited. So, in general, the Iranians, because they've been forced to become more self-reliant, even though they're being hurt, the pace in which the decline is taking place across the region is much greater than in Iran. I'd like to compare it to, you both may remember, although I'm not quite sure Alastair would be that much interested. I'm not a fan of boxing, but Muhammad Ali in one of his most famous fights with George Foreman, he was expected to lose
the
back.
rumble in the jungle.
The rumble in the jungle. Everyone thought Muhammad Ali was going to be destroyed, and he had great sympathy. This was, he didn't fight in Vietnam. African Americans loved him. Many did. Then when Vietnam was exposed for what it was, he became universally popular in the United States. He was a brilliant man, a genius, good-looking, very smart. But in the ring, he showed his brilliance in that particular fight. Again, I'm not a fan of boxing, but because he didn't go to Vietnam, obviously I and many of us have certain feelings towards him. When he fought, what he did was he would hit Foreman, then he would try to anger Foreman through certain phrases and words that he would say in the ring, and then he would back off and lie on the ropes. And this is something that he later called rope-a-dope. So Foreman would get angry, he would beat him. Foreman was very strong, very powerful. Everyone thought he'd win. And most of his opponents would be knocked out by the second round. So it went to the second round, then the third, then the fourth. And what happened was that in the eighth round, Foreman had basically tired himself out, and Muhammad Ali knocked him out. So while the situation across the board is deteriorating, and obviously Muhammad Ali in round 8 was not the Muhammad Ali of round 1, but his antagonist had declined much more rapidly. So this is sort of how I see the situation in the region, where Iran's antagonists and other countries in the region, I wouldn't consider Turkey to be Iran's antagonist or Qatar to be Iran's antagonist. But these countries, different countries, in this moment of great economic crisis, they're declining much more rapidly, and they're also at each other's throats across the board, and especially in Libya as we speak. And we don't know what's going to happen in Libya, but even now, it's costing both sides a lot to build up their military in that country. Again, it's the spoils of Libya, and it really is revealing that Iran was right all along in Syria, because these countries that were together destroying Syria, now they're destroying what's left of Libya. It has nothing to do with Iran. It has nothing to do with Assad or anything like that. So, but that's another story. So I think that the decline of these countries in the region make it much more difficult for the United States, because these countries, I think, are moving towards uncertainty. And I think that as time goes on, the real question is, can some of these countries actually survive? Because the price of oil, I don't think it's going to go back up. And with the rise of the virus and its spread across the world, and the U.S. clearly moving towards economic depression, and these countries, their sovereign wealth funds, they're worth much less than before. Much of the things that they've bought, no one is going to, today, who wants to buy a football club? So these sovereign wealth funds, their values have declined, their earnings have declined, their expenditures are up. I don't see how the Americans really can do much against Iran. So while it is possible that there may be a false flag operation, and CENTCOM is a sort of loose cannon, but I think that the balance of power has shifted so far away from the United States and its allies in this region. The Americans want to actually decrease their footprint and put more and have their regional proxies and allies carry more of the burden. But the problem is that these proxies and allies, they're unable to carry this burden. They are growing weaker. So it is possible that something may happen in the next 90 days, but it will not be that easy, and especially since the United States is so deeply divided. If something happens, I'm very sure that, unlike in previous cases where people would rally around the flag in the United States and rally around the president, I think as soon as something happens, Trump's adversaries and opponents will quickly point to Trump and say that this is an attempt to change
wag the dog, essentially.
Exactly, to change the balance in the U.S. election and to help him gain re-election. So I think it's going to be I don't think I doubt it will happen for these reasons. But again, the United States has become more unpredictable than ever before. And that's why the Iranians have carried out these very extensive maneuvers over the last couple of days, just to give a warning to CENTCOM that if something happens, they'll be hit back very hard.
Thank you so much on behalf of the Institute for North American and European Studies, and sorry for the poor quality of the sound. And also, I think there was some problem with internet connection, but I'm not sure if this was the case. So sorry again, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
It was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
An enormous pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Great on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.